Hello and welcome to Indigenous History and Culture in Canada with Dr. Dawn Lavelle-Harvard in honor of National Indigenous Month. My name is Catherine Philogène and I'm the chair of the Whitby Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee and will be your host for this evening's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like us to take a moment to remember and honor the 215 children whose remains were found at the Kamloops Residential School in British Columbia. May we reflect on our history as a nation and the continued work of reconciliation we have in front of us. Now, a few housekeeping items. For the duration of the webinar, which is being recorded on June 14th, 2021, participants will be in listen-only mode. The chat function will be available for you to ask questions for the Q&A session, which will take place after our guest speakers' prepared remarks. While we invite constructive dialogue, this is a safe space for all, and comments shared in the chat, which are inappropriate, disrespectful, or racist, will not be tolerated. Mayor Dawn Mitchell will now share a few remarks to formally welcome Dr. Dawn Lavelle-Harvard, and I would also like to welcome Lynn Davis, Director of Enwying Institute for Professional Learning at Trent University.
No sound.
Respectfully share in the responsibility of the stewardship and environmental protection of these ancestral lands. June is National Indigenous History Month, and this is an opportunity to learn more about the rich history of the Indigenous peoples. Because acknowledging our shared history helps us all understand the importance of respecting and preserving Indigenous language, culture, and history. I would like to welcome Dr. Dawn Lavelle-Harvard, who is a proud member of the Weequahic First Nation of Manitoulin Island. Dr. Harvard is the director of the First Peoples House of Learning at Trent University and has dedicated herself to advancing the rights and protection of Native women. Welcome, Dr. Harvard.
Chimigwech, Mani, Bonjour, Sego, Segoli, Skanagoa, Bonjour, good evening. And if I kept going long enough, I'd hit one that everybody knows. Dawn Harvard Dijnakas, Weequahic Donjaba. I want to start our meeting today also by acknowledging that we are gathered here today, and Trent University is located on the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. And many of us here at Trent, when our new students arrive, they have no idea what this tradition is. You know they do a land acknowledgement, but really don't understand where that comes from. And it comes from a long tradition that long before contact, when we all lived in distinct nations, side by side, distinct communities, that when we entered into another nation's territory, for example, as Anishinaabe, as Ojibwe, if we went into the territory of the Haudenosaunee people, when we get to the edge of our territory and the entrance to another territory, we would stop at the edge, stop at the clearing, and we would acknowledge that we are entering into this new territory. And it's a way of showing respect. It's a way of showing that we are recognizing that we are here as guests. And by saying that, we are recognizing, that we will eventually go home again. And that's a sign of peace. That's a sign of our acknowledgement of whose land we're in. And again, much like the in-laws, we don't want to have people overstaying their welcome. And so it's an important part of acknowledging that we are a guest. And as mentioned, I am from the Weequahic First Nation on Manitoulin Island, so I too am a guest here in the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We can advance to the next slide. And one of the things I wanted to share with everybody, when we got together to have a conversation about, what can we discuss during Indigenous Treaty Month? And there's so much to learn, so much to talk about. And, especially with all of the current things that are happening with the finding of the 215, there's so much that we need to know and that we need to discuss. And one of the things we talked about was, we're going to be, most importantly for me, is to tell you my story. And that is one important experience, because I can't claim to represent the experience of all Indigenous people, but I can share my story. And as I was thinking about what I was going to share with you in terms of indigeneity, I was reminded of a time when I was invited by my daughter's grade 3 class. Her teacher asked me to come. It was their week for social studies, and they're studying Native peoples in their unit. And she said, she wasn't really comfortable. She didn't want to step wrong. Could I come and give a presentation to the class? And so I came in and I gave my presentation to the class, talked about, our culture, our traditions. We did a smudge with the students and, explained where I was from. And at the end of the session, one of these little boys, he puts up his hand and he says, and we were doing questions, and he says, "You keep saying you're Native," he says, "but you can't be Indigenous because you live on my street." And then he says, "And I've seen you. You drive a Honda. You got a minivan." And my brain is like trying to click in fast. What's going on here? Why? And I realized the problem is that because his only experience of indigeneity, his only experience of Indigenous people was through Walt Disney movies and, old John Wayne Westerns, because his grandpa was a fanatic, that in his mind, I could not be an authentic, a real Indigenous person and still live in a subdivision or still drive a car. Because in his mind, Indians live in teepees and have horses and they're out on the prairies. So we wanted to sit down and, have a conversation for that little guy about what does it mean? And the problem is fundamentally that for Indigenous people here in Canada, because this is our homeland, because this is our land, we can't point to some other far and distant country to show the sort of authentic Indigenous identity. And so in much the same way that, we don't expect Scotsmen to be wearing kilts every day to work if they're working at McDonald's or at the, government of Canada. Yet at the same time, because we can look at Scotland today and see the sort of what it means to be Scottish in 2021. And so the problem is for Indigenous people, because this is our homeland and ideas of, what it means to be culturally Indigenous are frozen. Our homeland is frozen in time in a sort of pre-contact era for a lot of people, as opposed to geography. We can't point to some other country to look at contemporary Indigenous peoples. So people's notions of what it means to be a real Indigenous person are stuck in that time in a pre-contact era. So in much the same way that we don't expect non-Indigenous people to still be living in Saudis, we can't expect contemporary Indigenous people to be living in teepees and having dog sleds while everybody else has snow machines and pickup trucks. So, so for this little guy, really to sit down and have a talk about what does it mean to be Indigenous in 2020 or 2021. And I mean, I have had that experience of everybody from, school teachers to some boyfriend's parents say, funny, you don't look Indigenous. And a friend of mine who's Inuit, she said her grandson looked at her and he says, "This is what Indigenous looks like in 2021. Get with it." And it was a really powerful moment for us to learn and to embrace, to understand that we have our traditions, we have our culture, we have our origins, but culture and indigeneity is fluid, it changes, and many Indigenous people, depending on their own personal experiences, are still learning their culture and their language because of that history of living in a country in a colonial process, which has tried so hard to erase that identity. So one of the things as we go through, and we can change to the next slide, as I'm sharing with you my story, it reminded me that my story is in fact about a 50-year struggle to be Indigenous, to have the right to be Indigenous. Because in 1970, Jeanette Corbier-Laval, my mother, an Ojibwe woman from Wikwemikong, married David Laval, who was a non-Indian. And this one simple act would start a decades-long series of court battles that would change the lives of over hundreds of thousands of Aboriginal people in Canada. Because when my mom married my father, she lost her status. She lost her right to be an Indian under the Indian Act, because under Section 12(1)(b) of the Indian Act, an Indian was defined under the Indian Act of Canada, which still governs our lives, as an Indian man, as the wife of an Indian man, or the child of an Indian man. And I'm saying Indian specifically, even though I know that we don't use Indian. It's not politically correct. We don't want to, continue just because Columbus got lost and, wouldn't ask for directions and thought he was in India. We know all of that. The problem is that we are still governed by the Indian Act here in Canada. So in this context, when we're talking about legal Indian Act, that's what it was about. And so my mom lost her status because under this law, when she married a non-Indian, she became the wife of a non-Indian. And so she lost her status, which means she lost her home, she lost her land. In fact, she lost her right to ever even return to her community. But she knew this was wrong. When the Canadian government sent her a check for $35 and said that your name has been struck from the National Indian Registry, she knew this was wrong because this didn't happen to First Nations. This didn't happen to Indian men. In fact, their wives gained status even if they had no Indigenous ancestry, were completely non-Indigenous, they had no language, no culture, they gained status. They got a status card, they got the right to live in our communities where our women had been removed because of marriage. So because they knew this was wrong, this was the 1970s, and according to my father, the fastest way to make sure an Indian woman does something is to tell her she can't. So she decided she was going to fight this, and she went to court. They went and they got a lawyer, and they lost at the county court level, but then they appealed and they went to the Federal Court of Appeal, where in fact it was determined that of course it was gender discrimination because Indian men weren't treated the same as Indian women under the Indian Act. But this was a very short-lived victory for them because the Canadian government would appeal this to the Supreme Court of Canada. And at that Supreme Court of Canada, the National Indian Brotherhood came out to speak against the women, and there was no one to speak for the women. And they framed it as a question of sovereignty, saying what we really need to do is get rid of the Indian Act. And absolutely, we need to get rid of the Indian Act. The problem is that if we're going to have a conversation about what's going to replace the Indian Act, then we need to have all of those women and their children and grandchildren have their right to return to their communities, to be reinstated, so that we can have that full of people talking about what's going to replace the Indian Act, what is going to define our lives and our relationship here in Canada. One of the saddest things is that when they were in the Supreme Court, and they lost by one vote, actually, and one of those Supreme Court justices said that he didn't see what all the fuss was about and why she was challenging this. Because he said, we all know what it's like on an Indian reserve. You should be happy that a white man would marry you because you're better off. And that was his attitude. And our women, they refused to accept this. And even though they lost at the Supreme Court of Canada, they would eventually take it to the United Nations and international human rights, where they were reinstated. And after 50 years, in the fall of 2019, right before the pandemic hit, 50 years, the struggle for those women, the Canadian government finally removed the discrimination, the last elements of discrimination in the Indian Act, and those women and grandchildren are now able to return to their communities. Hundreds of thousands of Indigenous women and their families were impacted because one woman stood up. Now, you might be wondering why I'm telling you this story, because I think my mom is great and I like to brag about her, which is true, and I do, but that's really not the point. The point of telling you this story is because it's an important example of how one person can make a difference. Because one woman, in fact, one very small woman, she's not even 5 feet tall anymore. My 12-year-old daughter was recently very excited that she was now taller than grandma, and her sisters didn't want to ruin her moment and tell her that, being taller than grandma isn't really much of an achievement in my family because grandma's not even 5 feet tall anymore, and the average third grader is taller than grandma. But one very small Indigenous school teacher from Manitoulin Island stood up against the government of Canada and made a difference in the lives of hundreds of thousands of Indigenous women and children. because she stood up, because she spoke out. We'll go to the next slide. And she began a process. One of the most important things we realized is that when she went to court, there was no one to speak for the Indigenous women. And so they decided to create their own organizations. Back when she was in court, they created the Ontario Native Women's Association, groups like Indian Rights for Indian Women, and eventually, the Native Women's Association of Canada, to create spaces and voices to allow Indigenous women to speak up for themselves. And out of these organizations, in addition to the conversation about status, about the right to belong to our communities and our right to return to our homes, when they sat around these tables at the Native Women's Associations and started talking about what was it that was preventing our women from having the quality of life that we want for our children, the quality of life that other people in Canada achieve for their children and their families, and they said it was the violence. When they did the study called Breaking Free, it said that in many communities, 75% of the women were experiencing violence, and in some communities, it was as high as 95%. And when we went to Kelowna to have a conversation about how we were going to improve the situation for Indigenous people here in Canada, they didn't even want to allow it on the agenda. They wanted to talk about education, they wanted to talk about land claims, they wanted to talk about health and economic development, and with the notion that once we have our land claims settled and once we have economic development, then violence was going to magically sort itself out. But we all know this isn't true. So we kept talking about the violence. We kept talking about how do we improve safety for our children and our families. And so we started the Sisters in Spirit campaign. And when we started, we had the names of over 500 Indigenous women and girls who were missing or had been murdered. And we were continuing to gather names. And when we got up to 680, and we were starting to have conversations internationally, people were talking about the stolen sisters. And it was at that point that the Harper government shut us down because Canada was starting to get a black eye. People were talking about the violence, and we were told that we could not continue, that we would not be getting any more funding for our employment initiatives or any of our other work that we do. If we continue, we could not use the Sisters in Spirit name. We could not continue to do research. But as I said, the fastest way to make sure an Anishinaabe woman does something is to tell her she can't. So we did it anyways. And if it meant we had to do it on our own time, we did it on our own time. We volunteered, we searched the internet, and we were up to 800 names. And that's when the RCMP came forward and said, you're just a women's group. You don't have access to the real data. And they were going to set out to prove us wrong. And they did a comprehensive review of the police reports from over 300 distinct divisions. And they came back and they proved us wrong. They came back with the names of over 1,181 Indigenous women and girls, and we had only had 800. So yes, they proved us wrong, but our own national police force showed that the problem was even bigger than what we had. And we know that this is not just an Indigenous issue, and this is not just a women's issue. This is a human rights issue when any group in Canada is not safe. And we can move to the next slide. But then when we ask these, the RCMP, they look at these reports. And so, we're trying to understand why are Indigenous women so much more vulnerable? And they use these arguments. They talked about at risk. They analyzed all of those numbers they had, all of those cases, and they did these nice little pie charts. I was sitting at a conference in a room with 300 RCMP officers. I have to admit, I have never felt so unsafe in my whole life. All these uniforms out there, this whole sea of uniforms. But they started showing, they had these nice pie charts, and they said, well, it's because Indigenous women are more at risk. He claims that, they're twice as likely, those Indigenous women that they had analyzed from their numbers were twice as likely to have income from criminal activity compared to non-Aboriginal women, non-Indigenous women. 18% versus 9% for non-Indigenous women. And I thought, wow. And then I thought, wait a minute, 18%. If 18% had income from criminal activity, that means 82% didn't. 82% were totally legitimate. They were just working at the restaurant or the gas station, or they were a school teacher or a student. So why were we focusing on that small percentage? And they said, well, no, wait, you have to understand that, Indigenous women are twice as likely to be involved in the sex trade. They're putting themselves in risky situations. 12% for Indigenous women versus 6% for non-Indigenous women. And I said, again, I know my math is terrible, but that means 88% were not involved in the sex trade. They were just somebody's mother, somebody's sister, somebody's daughter. But they continued along this line. They talked about how they were more likely to be under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And, I have to admit, I work here at a university, and if being under the influence of alcohol meant that you were more likely to be a victim of homicide, I've been here during Frosh Week, or Orientation Week, we call it now. And, we'd have some real serious problems. So we started saying, we need to stop blaming the victims in this situation and start looking at what is it that is putting our women, Indigenous women, making them more vulnerable in Canadian society. And we'll move to the next slide. And they said Indigenous women, living in poverty, have high risk lifestyles. They're out on the streets. And I realized that, yeah, as much as I hate to admit it, I agreed with the RCMP on this one. Yes, our women have higher risk lifestyles, but not because they chose a high risk lifestyle. Our women have a high risk lifestyle because they were born at risk as a result of hundreds of years of broken treaties, of oppression and abuse. Our women are born at risk. When you're born into a First Nation that has no housing, that has no hydro, they have no jobs, no schools, not even clean water, basic human rights, education and clean water. And so we have communities that are struggling to survive in third world conditions in the middle of one of the richest countries in the world. So yes, our women and girls are in higher risk, but not because they chose. It's because they were born into communities that are high risk. And how did this happen? How did we get to a place where we can have communities that are living in third world conditions in this country? And it was a very long, deliberate process that unfortunately we have seen, despite arguments that say that the Canadian government wanted Indigenous people to, settle down and learn to live agricultural lifestyles like non-Indigenous people did. And, it ignores the fact that many Indigenous nations, such as the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquoian peoples, had very complex agricultural societies and very good agricultural skills. And, were quite well known for their growing. The Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Michisagi, not so much. Our sort of agricultural efforts we were much more along the lines of, and my grandmother always complained about this, we would plant our crops in the spring, and then we would go off to wherever the summer fishing grounds were, and then we come back in the fall and we would sort of harvest whatever had managed to survive while we were gone. And although that actually sounds a lot like my garden most years, this was actually part of a cultural tradition. But it shows that we did have agricultural traditions, and we had the knowledge of how plants had to be put together, really important scientific knowledge that is only now beginning to be understood when we talk about corn, beans, and squash as the three sisters, that the planting of those three plants together utilizes, the nutrients from one and the nitrogen in a way that allows all three plants to be symbiotic and to grow better when they're planted in these traditional ways. And this was part of our traditional science and our traditional knowledge. And the Canadian government decided that, instead of being nomadic and hunting and fishing, they wanted Indigenous people to be able to learn their agricultural practices. And yet, then they passed laws saying that Indigenous people could not use implements. They had to be agricultural, but only use sticks. They couldn't use farm implements because they had this notion that we had to pass through some primitive stage before we could learn how to use. And so even though our people were not allowed to use farm implements, the same as non-Indigenous settlers in this country, because this was our land and because we had that powerful knowledge of what grows here, that we were able to grow enough for our families and even some extra to sell. And when Indigenous people started selling their produce to earn a few extra dollars to buy things for their families so that they could actually, really thrive, not just struggle to survive, the Canadian government passed laws against that too. You could no longer buy produce from an Indigenous person. And, there were huge fines, hundreds of dollars if somebody was caught purchasing produce grown by an Indigenous person. And so, it feels like just when, we're continuing to find ways to go around the laws and to continue to survive, the government came along and slapped new laws on every time we tried. So this is not a history of Indigenous people just giving up. This was a history of every time we tried to circumvent the system, new rules were put in place. And there were rules that if we didn't like it, if we wanted to try to fight for our human rights back in the 1920s, when women were talking about getting rights and Indigenous people and people of color were starting to talk about getting rights, we started to gather and talk about, we needed to fight this. We needed to fight for our land claims as these treaties were being broken and our people were being moved further and further away into increasingly poorer areas. We wanted to stand up and fight for our rights. And then the government passed legislation that said Indigenous people can't hire lawyers, and we can't even fundraise to hire lawyers because it became against the law for lawyers to act on behalf of Indigenous people. And so in this way, they created a situation where Indigenous peoples couldn't fight for their rights. And even at this point in Canada, because we were not persons under the laws of Canada. And this is something that is very often forgotten, that you can't fight for your rights if you're not even considered people. How do you have human rights if we're not considered people in this country? And it was not until the 1960s, and it was not that long ago, that Indigenous people, that Indians were considered persons under the law of Canada. Even though women got the right to be considered persons back in the 1920s, Indigenous people didn't get that right until the 1960s. So you can understand how when we have, when people ask questions about, why are we now having standoffs over land in Oka or land in Caledonia, why are you people getting upset, decades later? It's because we were not allowed to stand up for our rights. And it was not until the 1960s. And so it's only now that many of these land claims, that many of these fights for our rights are coming to the courts because we were prevented from doing so up until that point. So you can see how, the Canadian government then at a certain point decided that it was cheaper to feed the Indians, as they called them, than to fight them. And they would provide food stores. And then somebody decided that it would be cheaper to educate rather than continue feeding. And then we had the traditions of the schools. And our people wanted education. Our people wanted our young people to learn how to survive in this new country that is Canada. But the problem was, when our children, were taken to the residential schools, which were really about assimilation, not so much about learning. And, when we saw the conditions and when these children were being taken away, our people started to hide the children, started not sending our children, not because we don't believe in education, but we don't believe in an education that takes our children away from who they are, from their families and their communities. And many people don't realize, as the horrors of these recent residential school findings have shown us about just how horrific the situation was in those residential schools. And so when you have this history come together of the treaties being broken and our people being herded into increasingly smaller and smaller lands, so that now, if you were to take all of the reserves in Canada and clump them all together, it would cover less than 0.5% of our original territories. So we went from we went from occupying all of Canada in distinct nations, coast to coast to coast across Canada, to being compressed into these little tiny spaces that even put together wouldn't cover less than 0.5% of our original territories. And all of our reserves covered together, all of the land that those little bits we have left, wouldn't even cover half of what the Navajo reservation has in the United States. Not even half of one reservation. So when we look and we wonder why Indigenous people are living in poverty, if you have a farmer up here north of Peterborough and Selwyn somewhere, or, up in Brooklyn, north of Whitby, and he has 100 acres, and all of a sudden somebody comes along and they expropriate, he's got all this land for his cows and his sheep, and he's growing his crops for his families. And then they come along because they're going to put the 407's got to go through, and they take away everything except that last 0.5, little town lot. How is he going to grow enough food to feed his family over the next winter? How are they going to survive? And that's what happened to our people when we were compressed into less than 0.5% of our original territories. How do we survive? How do we keep feeding our families and communities? And that's how we end up in a situation where over 40% of Aboriginal women are living in poverty, and more than half of Indigenous children. And we'll go to the next slide. But I've always wondered about how we have studies of child poverty, because I've never understood how you can have a study that says 50 to 60% of Indigenous children are living in poverty, it's a bit of a ridiculous concept because Indigenous children, First Nations children living in poverty are not living with moms who drive BMWs and work on Bay Street. And we don't have communities of children like Peter Pan had in the Peter Pan, where you have little communities of lost boys living as orphans in the bush. Indigenous children, First Nations children living in poverty are living in families living in poverty. Typically, they're single parent families and typically single mother families living in poverty. And unfortunately, because of this situation, we'll go to the next slide. Because of the poverty, we now have a situation where there are more children now in the care of the child welfare system than were in the residential schools. In some provinces, the child welfare, the children in foster care are 80%, even though we are less than 4% of the Canadian population. And our kids are twice as likely to be apprehended for neglect. And I had somebody come and ask me, well, what should we do? What are you supposed to do if these kids are being neglected? And I thought about that for a while, and I realized, because I used to teach at Queen's University. And at Queen's University, I was in the Faculty of Education, and we had to teach our up-and-coming teacher candidates, these ones who are going to be going into the classrooms. And one of the things we talked about is, their professional responsibilities. And so we taught them, when you were in the classroom, if you have a child who is coming to school and, they don't have lunch consistently, that's a sign of neglect. You have to watch for that. If you have children who are coming to school, this is Canada, if this is January and they're coming to school and they don't have proper gloves or warm hats, a warm coat and boots, that's neglect. That's a parent who is neglectful. And you have to report them to the child welfare authorities, and the social workers come in. And, if you have kids who are coming to school and they're not clean on a regular basis, they're unwashed, they're not clean, that's neglect. But we need to think about things differently, because I'm here to tell you is that sometimes what looks like neglect is poverty. And that mom, oftentimes she went without lunch for a week so that her kids would have something to take to school. Because when you have to choose between buying food for your family or paying your hydro or your rent, there's not enough to go around. And when you don't have enough money for that first pair of mittens or hat for your child, how do you pay to replace them when they lose those? And they have to go without because you can't afford proper warm clothes. And how do you keep your kids clean if you don't have a home, if you don't have water in your home? Or if you're sleeping on somebody's couch or in your car because you don't have housing, you don't have hydro, how do you keep your kids clean? This is not neglect, this is poverty. And I, would hesitate to hold up anything in the United States as an example sometimes, but there are several states in the US that say you cannot apprehend children for reasons of poverty. They have to invest X amount into supports for housing, for food, for employment, to try to get the parents a job instead of apprehending. And if we had some of those kind of policies, that apprehension was not the automatic solution, then we would have very different situations and very different outcomes for our children. And we'll move to the next slide. And then we ask ourselves, some days when you have to think about a mom who goes without so that her kids can have something for school to eat. I don't want to do this job anymore. I don't want to think about girls that go missing. I don't want to think about moms that can't afford to feed their kids or can't wash them because they live in communities that don't have clean water. Communities like Curve Lake, I'm not talking about remote communities in far and distant places. I'm talking about communities 10 minutes from Trent University that still don't have clean water. Some communities haven't had clean water in 20 years. In some communities, it will never be clean because you cannot boil away toxins. But on these days, I'm reminded that we can't be overwhelmed, that we can't become paralyzed by the enormity of this situation, because there is hope. And I've seen it just this week when we heard about the finding of 215 children Their remains at the residential school. And across Canada, people came out. People put red, orange shirts. They put teddy bears on their porch. They put shoes out because people finally opened their eyes and opened their hearts. And now they can't unknow this. Now we can't unknow what happened. And when we're asked, what do we want? You know, those vigils all across the country were important for us, for those families, for those survivors of the residential schools to know that they have support, that people won't be turning a blind eye anymore to the suffering that happened in the residential schools. But more importantly, we don't need more memorials. They're important for closure, they're important for grieving, but what we need now is change. We need concrete change for our communities. And we saw just today that the federal government is still continuing to fight to not, to fight against a human rights tribunal that awarded financial support to Indigenous children, to First Nations children from the child welfare discrimination. And they're continuing to fight. And so what can we do? I mean, even if I was to get every First Nations man, woman, and child and load them into school buses and drive us all the way to Ottawa. I mean, if such a logistical feat could even be conceived of, which I'm sure, even if we did that, it would still be such a tiny voice that those who have the power to make decisions can just ignore it, because that's not, obviously they call it a special interest group, or they call it's when it becomes a concern for all Canadians, when this becomes a Canadian issue, that's when things change. And we have to remember that we're all treaty people. Those treaties were signed on behalf of the settlers and on behalf of First Nations people. And that means regardless of which side of that equation you fall on, we are inheritors of those treaties. And so it's important that we educate ourselves and that we uphold our responsibilities. And right now, that means acknowledging those treaties that were broken, and how we fix that, how we fix decades of neglect, how we stand up and speak out for those who don't have a voice, for those 215. And we'll go to the next slide. Because if we're not part of the solution, then we're part of the problem. And sometimes just staying silent means we're part of the problem. Because right now, First Nations children are more likely to end up in jail than they are to graduate high school. And because of the way education is funded in this country, people don't realize that First Nations children are still discriminated against. First Nations children still receive, in some areas, less than half per capita for their education than non-Indigenous children 2 minutes down the road that happen to be off the reserve. And so you can imagine what that turns into after year of our children having less than half of the funds, but dealing oftentimes with some of the most complex educational needs. And then we wonder why Indigenous people don't have the same educational achievement. It said right now it will take 28 years to close the education gap at the current rate, 30 years worth of children. And that's if we fixed it right now. If we continue to discriminate against First Nations children, we will continue to have children who are more likely to end up in jail. So this is what we can do. We can stand up, we can speak out, we can write a letter to your MP, you can put it on social media, so that we can do better for the First Nations children who are out there right now. On behalf of those children, those 215 who had nobody to speak up for them, we can be that voice for those children. We can do things differently. We can demand that our government do things differently, because we all know now what has happened, and we have a chance to be that agent of change, to make this a Canadian issue, to make this a human rights issue, because education is a human right. I'll go to the next slide. And one of the most important things, when we talk about improving circumstances so that our children can really thrive instead of just survive, so that our children are not going to school in schools that are full of mold or that have no books, schools that have no clean water. When we come to that place We know that right now in Canadian history, we're entitled to declare a victory because we have survived. We are still here despite generations of residential schools, of child welfare agencies, of policies that tried to assimilate us. Our people are still here. And when we are stronger than ever, we couldn't practice our traditions, our dances. And I'm sure a lot of people this year have a small taste of what it was like when we couldn't gather together for funerals, when people this year couldn't gather together for weddings or for birthdays or for holidays because of the pandemic. We have a small feeling of what that feeling was like when our people were no longer allowed to celebrate, when our people were not allowed to have our traditional dances and ceremonies and celebrations, when our people were not allowed to gather together because it was against the law. That only changed, in the 1970s when those things were repealed. And now we are able to sing. We are able to revitalize our traditions and our languages. And our young people are learning. And we are stronger than ever. And people don't realize that Canadian society has benefited so much from Indigenous history and Indigenous traditions. We all know about canoes and we know about toboggans and snowshoes, and we wouldn't have any of those things if it wasn't for Indigenous knowledge. But we don't realize hammocks were invented by Indigenous people to keep you up off the ground, to keep you safe from all of the creatures here in Canada. And it was the sailors that saw these brilliant inventions and took them back in their ships. Kind of wish they hadn't seen that because, Columbus could have carried on his way. Rubber. Something every single one of us uses on our vehicles as we're driving or our bicycles was invented by Indigenous people. Many of the foods I've had people ask me, as First Nations people, what do you have? What do you celebrate? What foods do you eat at Thanksgiving? And I giggle because I eat the same things as everybody else, because you don't realize that when you're eating turkey and pumpkins and squash and cranberries, and you are eating traditional Indigenous feast right there. And, the potato, the sweet potato, the common bean, corn, chocolate, something that I personally cannot survive without. Avocados, quinoa, tomatoes, and wild rice and squash. Those are all Indigenous foods that nobody would have if it wasn't. Those are Indigenous. The aspirin, something that, we all take to make sure you don't have a heart attack, or, boss is nagging you and you're starting to get a headache and you need, that comes from willow tree bark to reduce the fever and pain, because our people knew these traditional medicines. Gum, chewing gum, something actually I wish we hadn't invented, because quite frankly, it drives me bonkers when some kid spits it on the sidewalk and it's stuck to my shoe, and now it's stuck to and in this heat, you can never get it off. But chewing gum is actually, we are forced to claim responsibility for that horrible invention. And especially if anybody here is, parents or teachers and you have a gum snapping teenager, my personal apologies, I will take responsibility. But also hunting decoys. People don't realize, all of you who like to put on your camel and go out and hang out and, catch yourself a goose, the tradition of using decoys, of using fake geese, began with the James Bay Cree, who made fake geese from tamarack, from branches to attract the geese as they came. So next time you go to Bass Pro, now that it's all open and you have a chance, know that that's where that tradition came from. And whether we're talking about lacrosse or snow goggles, those of you who like to ski, those are invented by Indigenous people to protect yourself from the glare. And so any notions, any fallacies anybody had about us being primitive and backwards are just flat out wrong. We had significantly advanced technologies for survival in this particular climate. And including our way of life was really important for sustainably surviving in this particular environment. And so we can go to the next slide. When we ask ourselves what we can do, that, when we have, as we said, it's been a really hard couple of weeks for everybody, as we have seen what happened to those 215 children. And instead of, when we get bogged down, and we need, every single one of us needs to ask ourselves what we can do to make a difference. And I had a day when, I've had lots of them, where it's just too much, where, talking about kids from residential schools, supporting families whose daughters had been murdered. It's too much, and I didn't want to do it anymore. And I was at the UN, the United Nations in Manhattan, and I was just done because it seemed like nobody was listening to us, and girls were going missing more and more, and we weren't making any progress. And I was going to quit, just go back to my hotel and pull the blankets back over my head and go back home. And I was really frustrated. And this woman from South America came up to me and she says, I don't understand why you're giving up, why you're so frustrated. And she says, I've seen that you have that hummingbird spirit. And I thought she was making fun of me for being kind of short, like my mom, and feisty, because we know hummingbirds are kind of small and feisty. And she said, no, I've seen, because you wear this skirt. And I had this hummingbird embroidered on my skirt. And she said, you have that spirit. And I didn't have the heart to tell her that I was wearing that skirt because after 2 weeks in New York City eating in restaurants, it had a stretchy waistband. And so it was the only skirt that fit me anymore at that point in our trip. Nothing else. I'd popped the buttons off, everything else. And she said, no. She said, I've seen you have that spirit. And she said, I want to tell you a story from my people from a long time ago. There was a time when the forests were burning. All the jungles were burning, raging with fires. And everybody was running away. Everybody that could get away was running away. And while they were running away, there was this one little tiny hummingbird that was flying to the river and picking up one little drop of water in his beak and flying back to the fire and dropping that one little wee drop. And he was going back and forth, back and forth. And that little hummingbird, his little wings were getting singed, and his little tail and his feathers, and the other animals, and they asked him, they said, hummingbird, what do you think you're doing? One drop is never going to do anything. And that little hummingbird, without missing a beat of his little tiny wings, he said, I am doing the best that I can. Because one drop at a time, we can make a difference, because together, thousands and millions of raindrops, one drop is insignificant, but together it can become a torrential downpour that can put out the fires of racism, the fires that are of violence, the fires of sexism, can put out those fires. One drop at a time, those downpours flood our streams until those rivers change the very landscape that we live in. Anybody in downtown Peterborough knows, take out the whole downtown. It can change the very world we live in. And over time, one drop at a time, hundreds of years, one drop at a time, water can wear away the hardest of rock. If you've ever seen those rocks, that granite on the shore of Lake Huron, where those little pits, the holes, because it can wear away the hardest of barriers, one drop at a time, if you work long enough. And that's what this is about, because one drop at a time, if we all do something, we all do one small thing. We write a letter, we stand up, we speak out, we educate ourselves, we go to a vigil, we raise money for a local food bank or a shelter or Indigenous students in school so that they can get an education to support their families. If each person does one thing, if each person speaks out, then we can be those hummingbirds and we can change the world we live in so that our children won't be having the same conversation. We can begin that process of reconciliation. We can't wait for the governments to do it. Each person, if you do one small thing, we can change the world we live in. And you've already done that just by being here tonight and hearing our story and learning a little something and maybe carrying that forward with you. Chimigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Dawn, for sharing your story, for bringing us the truth about Indigenous people, Indigenous women in Canada. So thank you so much for that. One of the things that I'm committed to doing is to educate myself, but we know that there is a lot of misinformation out there. And so when people are looking for information, are there certain things we need to be mindful of, certain resources that may be the ones to go to? And I know you've shared some which we'll be putting on the website for our attendees, but any tips you can give us on, where to go for accurate information and to really deprogram us of the romanticized version of things that we learned when we were in school.
Thank you. And I think that's exactly it. Is, you know, looking at APTN is a great place to start. You know, they have so many great programs that will help us to understand, you know, our joint history. Because one of the things we need to remember, and it always drove me nuts, was, you know, how come we have Canadian history and, you know, Native history or Indigenous history in schools, when if we're in Canada, how can you have Canadian history without it being fully integrated? It is the history of Indigenous peoples here in Canada. And so, you know, trying to really educate ourselves, as you said, looking to, we've passed that reference list for you, and looking to groups, you know, you can look to groups such as the Ontario Native Women's Association, has some excellent resources. APTN is a great place to start in terms of just, you know, and very mainstream, very easy to get access, to start seeing different perspectives, different stories. Watching APTN news is a great way to get a different perspective on local contemporary Indigenous issues.
Great, thank you. And I just want to remind everyone, if you do have a question for Dawn, please feel free to either put it in the Q&A or in the chat box. And I did want to just address something else if I could. So in 2015, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they did make over 90 recommendations, but it seems that many of those have not really come to fruition. So from your standpoint, what are the things out of that report that really need to be put forward so that we really start to get things going?
Well, and thank you for that question. I think you've actually hit a perfect spot, which is the TRC had great recommendations for how everybody, depending on, you know, it wasn't about waiting for the government. It had recommendations for a wide variety of fields, whether you're an educator, whether you're working in healthcare and policing, that people can do to change. And, you know, number one, the most important is to understand how our history, how we got to where we are right away. And that's critical. But sit down and have a look at those TRC recommendations. But for me, my number one focus, now it may help that I'm sitting at Trent University, but is our children, is our students, is our young people, is those young generations that are growing up. And, you know, we have an opportunity here to change the environment, to give them the skills and give them the tools so that they can really succeed moving forward. And there's so much in the TRC recommendations about education, about improving education for Indigenous children, but also at the same time, improving education for non-Indigenous children so that we understand each other. So that, you know, I don't like notions. I really appreciate that you're, you know, diversity and inclusion, because it used to be, you know, we would talk about racial tolerance. And I actually really dislike that concept. I tolerate a headache. I tolerate my in-laws when I have to, minimally. But I don't want to be tolerated as an Indigenous person. I want to be respected. I want to be understood. I want to be embraced. And that's why inclusion, and that's why understanding each other is so important. And that's why it's just as important to be educating our non-Indigenous children, to educating everybody in the classroom should be taking an Indigenous studies course, an Indigenous history course, so that we understand each other. And that, you know, how do we build reconciliation if we don't have that? It's called truth and reconciliation. And if we don't have truth, then we can never get to reconciliation. And that's why it's so important that, you know, we teach everybody. And those, you know, even when they invented the environmental movement, you know, it was those children that influenced the behavior of those parents, those children who went home talking about recycling, talking about the environment. I mean, mine keeps adjusting the heat in my house. I thought I was hitting menopause because I kept having like hot flashes and then cold chills. And I realized it's because my child had signed up for Earth Rangers and was adjusting the temperature to try to save the environment and was freezing me out. But that it was children that really were at the forefront of that and were able to change the behaviors of their parents and really push for recycling and all those kinds of things. So investing in that education of all of our children so that they can have a different experience moving forward, and standing up and speaking out now that we know things differently, whether it be the Yahoo next to you at the gym, or, somebody at a dinner you're at that starts spouting off something racist. Open the conversation and say, don't say you're a racist, because that just shuts people down, but say, what you just said makes you sound like a racist. How about we talk about what you think the truth is, and here's some of the things I've learned, and, have some really good responses for that. Now,
well, and we know that, these conversations can often be very uncomfortable, but if we don't sit in that discomfort, it's hard to move the needle. And we do have a couple more questions. I'd like to apologize. It seems the chat function isn't actually working, but the Q&A function is. So if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A. So the first one is from someone who doesn't have a good understanding of the system of reservations. And so if you could elaborate on whether or not it's actually mandatory for Indigenous people to live on a reserve.
Okay, so yeah, great question. It was mandatory originally. It's no longer, but originally on the reserve, you could not live off the reserve if you were a status Indian. And in order to move off reserve, you had to give up your status. So you had to give up, you could live off reserve, but you had to give up being an Indian to do so. Or you could, if you wanted to remain a status Indian, you had to live on the reserve. And so, it was called enfranchisement. So you can imagine, though, that choice of having to choose, if I want an education past a certain level, I have to give up being a First Nations person. I have to give up being a status Indian, because if you got a university education, you were automatically no longer a status Indian. If you got any kind of professional designation, if you became a doctor, teacher, lawyer, if you became a member of the clergy, or you went to war, or you served in the armed forces, that you were automatically considered no longer an Indian. You were considered enfranchised and a Indian citizen. But you can imagine how tough that choice would be, that because Indian or reserves are, we used to have signs that said, this is a reserve. If you are not a status Indian, you cannot come into this territory. So legally, if you were not a status Indian, you could not go into the reserve. And that's why it was so hard for people like my mom when she lost her status. You can imagine a situation where you're no longer allowed to go see your family anymore. You're no longer allowed to be with your community. And so it created a situation where, people had to choose. And so now, absolutely, I can live off reserve, but we have to ask ourselves, what am I having to give up? What am I being asked to give up? And does anybody else in this society have to give up your family community in order to live where you want to live? And that doesn't happen. So yeah, thank you for that question. We don't have to. I live, as we said, I lived in a subdivision at one point, and I now live just south of Peterborough. One of the challenges is for a lot of First Nations people, if they do need supports, one of the debates we have right now is for their treaty rights. Very often, if they are administered through the reserve, it's not practical for, if I have a student here at Trent University who is from Muskrat Dam, for them to be accessing any kind of services, because they would have to, 16 hours to get back to their community. So it becomes a question of rights sometimes as well. So the other question is...
Yes, so we have one about fresh water, which you were talking about, that some of the water on the reserves can't be fixed due to toxins. And so this attendee would like to know more about the topic of water on the reserves.
Mm-hmm. So Lynn will be able to give us some more resources also. She has in there, but one of the really interesting things you can even just look up is Grassy Narrows, and look at what's happened with that community, the mercury that has contaminated that territory, and unfortunately it's still going on. So yeah, absolutely, Lynn will get some more resources out for. And there's a young woman named Autumn Peltier, who is doing tremendous work on trying to bring awareness to not just the issue of water on the First Nations territories, but the issue of water in general, in terms of, water sustains us. And if we are polluting our waterways and bottling it all up and letting Nielsen's, sell it off out from underneath us, we'll hit a point someday where we can't survive because we don't have clean water anymore.
So we had a few other attendees reach out to get information about organizations where they could make donations, and also appropriate reading for children on the subject. But I realized that we're already past 7:30. And so I'm wondering if it would be all right for us to follow up with the individuals whose questions have not been answered.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea. We can send some. And my personal favorite is usually for educational supports for students to really, lift our students up so that they can get an education, so that they can support their own families and provide for themselves, which is what everybody wants, right? And so, yeah, we will absolutely send some of that. And I think.
So if there are any other questions, and I see that there are quite a few that haven't been answered tonight, we'll work with you and ensure that we get responses back to those individuals, if that's all right with you and Lynn.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, I think I've often heard, some people say that after learning about this, history of how Indigenous people were dispossessed, and in this country, a certain amount of, people feeling shame for what happened before. And, I've always said, you don't need to feel shame for what happened before your generation, before you, for what your forefathers did. You're not responsible for that. But what you are responsible for is what we do with the privilege that we have now and with the knowledge that we have. So now that we know the situation, how do we work to change the circumstances so that Indigenous children have the same opportunities? Now that we know, how do we work to use our privilege and our voice to create equity for everybody here in Canada? And I think, how do we use our voice to speak out? We've seen that this isn't just about Indigenous children. I was horrified. I can't even begin to say how horrified I was for the loss of the family in London who were persecuted because of their religious beliefs. That kind of thing should never happen in this country. And we all need to stand up, because anytime we allow injustice against any group, we're allowing for the concept of injustice in Canada. And the minute you allow for the concept of injustice, it's only a matter of time before it's you. And so it needs to be, we can't have any group persecuted that way, because it puts all of us in danger, even though we don't see that. And so I think that's the biggest thing we can all do, is open our hearts, open our minds, and stand up and speak out when these things happen and support each other.
Thank you so much, Dawn. I'd like to wrap up our webinar. And on behalf of the Whitby Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee, I'd like to thank the Town of Whitby, Mayor Don Mitchell, Dr. Lavelle Harvard, Lynn Davis, and all our participants who took the time to be with us this evening. Thank you. So we invite you to visit whitby.ca/diversity to either get in touch or stay up to date on upcoming events. We'll also be sharing some of the resources we mentioned tonight. And if you haven't already done so, we encourage you to visit connectwhitby.ca to get your thoughts on Whitby's journey to inclusivity. So thanks again, and good night.